This will probably conclude Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance. We continue with chapter 14, The Author. The curious, synthetic belief, united, as it was, with the highly popular cult of Mithra, traveled with the foreign legionaries, adherents of that cult, to the farthest bounds of the Roman Empire, and when the struggle between Mithraism and Christianity ended in the definite triumph of the latter, by virtue of that dual synthetic nature, the higher ritual still survived and was celebrated in sites removed from the centers of population, in caves and mountain fastnesses, in islands, and on desolate seacoasts. The earliest version of the Grail story, represented by our Blaheris form, relates the visit of a wandering knight to one of these hidden temples, his successful passing of the test into the lower grade of life, initiation, his failure to attain to the highest degree. It matters little whether it were the record of an actual or of a possible experience, the casting into romantic form of an event which the storyteller knew to have happened, had perchance actually witnessed, or the objective recital of what he knew might have occurred. The essential fact is that the mise en scene of the story, the nomenclature, the march of the incident, the character of the tests, corresponds to what we know from independent sources of the details of this nature ritual. The Grail quest was actually possible then. It is actually possible today, for the indication of our two romances as to the final location of the Grail is not imagination, but the record of actual fact. As first told, the story preserved its primal character of a composite between Christianity and the nature ritual, as witnessed by the ceremony over the bier of the dead knight, the procession with the cross and incense, and the solemn vespers for the dead. This, I suspect, correctly represents the final stage of the process by which Attis Adonis was identified with Christ. Well, there was a whole bunch of Christ, but that's another point. I mean, even according to the Bible. Thus, in its first form, the story was the product of conscious intention, but when the tale was once fairly launched as a romantic tale and came into the hands of those unfamiliar with its ritual origin, though the fact that it had such an origin was probably well understood, the influence of the period came into play. The Crusades and the consequent traffic in relics, especially in relics of the Passion, caused the identification of the sex symbols, lance and cup, with the weapon of the crucifixion and the cup of the Last Supper. But the Christianization was merely external, the tale as a whole retaining its pre-Christian character. The conversion into a definitely Christian romance seems to have been due to two causes. First, the rivalry between the two great monastic houses of Glastonbury and Fescamp, the latter of which was already in possession of a genuine Saint Song relic and fully developed tradition. There is reason to suppose that the initial combination of the Grail and the Saint Song traditions took place at Fescamp, and was the work of some member of the minstrel guild attached to that abbey, but the Grail tradition was originally British. Glastonbury was, from time immemorial, a British sanctuary. It was the reputed burial place of Arthur, of whose court the Grail quest was the crowning adventure. The story must be identified with British soil. Consequently, a version was composed, now represented by our Perilous Vows text, in which the union of Nicodemus of Pescamp and Joseph of Glastonbury fame, as ancestors of the Grail hero, offers a significant hint of the providence of the version. Secondly, a no less important element in the process was due to the conscious action of Robert de Boron, who well understood the character of his material and radically remodeled the whole on the basis of the triple mystery tradition translated into terms of high Christian mysticism. A notable feature of Baron's version is his utilization of the tradition of the final messianic feast in combination with his Eucharistic symbolism, a combination thoroughly familiar to early Christian mystics. Once started on a definitely romantic career, the Grail story rapidly became a complex of originally divergent themes, the most important stage in its development being the incorporation of the popular tale of the widow's son, brought up in the wilderness and launched into the world in a condition of absolute ignorance of men and manners. The Percival story is a charming story, but it has originally nothing whatever to do with the Grail. The original title, now being represented by our English Sir Percival of Gales, has no trace of mystery element. It is folklore, pure and simple. I believe the connection with the Grail legend to be purely fortuitous and due to the fact that the hero of the folk tale was known as the widow's son, which he actually was, while this title represented in mystery terminology a certain grade of initiation, and as such is preserved today in Masonic ritual. The Legend of Sir Percival, Volume 2, page 307, and its note, I've recently received Dr. Brugger's review, Mr. R. H. Griffith's study of the English poem, and I'm glad to see that the critic accepts the independence of this version. The scholars can see their way to accept as fates acquiesce the mutual independence of the Grail and Percival themes. We shall, at last, have a solid basis for future criticism. Finally, the rising tide of dogmatic medievalism, with its crassly materialistic view of the Eucharist, its insistence on the saving grace of asceticism and celibacy, and its scarcely veiled contempt for women, overwhelmed the original conception. Certain of the features of the ancient ritual indeed survive, but they are factors of confusion rather than clues to enlightenment. Thus, while the Grail still retains its character of a feeding vessel, comes and goes without visible agency, and supplies each knight with such food and drink as he best loved in the world, it is nonetheless the chalice of the sacred blood, and the critics are sorely put to it to harmonize these conflicting aspects. In the same way, Galahad's grandfather still bears the title of the rich fisher, and there are confused references to a land laid waste as the result of a dolorous stroke, but while the terminology lingers on to our perplexity, the characters involved lie outside the march of the story. Practically no traces of the old nature ritual survives in the final quest form. The remodeling is so radical that it seems most reasonable to conclude that it was purposeful, that the original author of the quest had a very clear idea of the real nature of the Grail, and was bent upon a complete reinstatement in terms of current orthodoxy. I advisedly use this term. I see no trace in the quest of a genuine mystic conception, such as that of Baron. So far as criticism of the literature is concerned, I adhere to my previously expressed opinion that the quest should be treated rather as a Lancelot than as a Grail romance. It is of real importance in the evolution of the Arthurian romantic cycle as a factor in determining the true character and origins of the Grail legend. It is worse than useless. What remains of the original features is so fragmentary and so distorted that any attempt to use the version as basis for argument or comparison can only introduce a further element of confusion into an already more than sufficiently involved problem. I am also still of opinion that the table of descent given on page 283 of Volume 2 of my Percival Studies represents the most probable evolution of the literature. At the same time, in the light of further research, I should feel inclined to add the Grail section of Sanadinanse as deriving from the same source, which gave us Quiot's poem and the Perles Faust as evidence for a French original, combining important features of these two versions, and at the same time retaining unmistakably archaic elements which have disappeared from both. I hold this section of the poem to be of extreme value for the criticism of the cycle. While there are still missing links to the chain of descent, versions to be reconstructed, writers to be identified, I believe that in its ensemble, the theory set forth in these pages will be found to be the only one which will satisfactorily meet all the conditions of the problem, which will cover the whole ground of investigation, omitting no element, evading no difficulty, which will harmonize apparently hopeless contradictions, explain apparently meaningless terminology, and thus provide a secure foundation for the criticism of a body of literature as important as it is fascinating. The study and the criticism of the Grail literature will possess an even deeper interest, a more absorbing fascination, when it is definitely recognized that we possess in that literature a unique example of the restatement of an ancient and august ritual in terms of imperishable romance. Now, I reiterated that Mithras kind of means intercessor, and initially not quite worshipped or intermediary, but Christianity definitely is Mithraism. It's a type of Mithraism. Okay, the back says, in Jessie Weston's own words, the Grail story is not the production of imagination, literary or popular. At its root lies the record, more or less distorted, of an ancient ritual, having for its ultimate object the initiation, the secret of life, physical and spiritual. And I guess we've read the book, and the summation on the back may be something particular to this printing, but this is a 1920 book.